All right, it's on. Is it on? Oh boy, is that too loud? Sounds okay. Wow, it's on. All right, well, welcome everyone to the Alembic. This is an illustrious crowd, I must say. I know many of you, and thank you for coming out for this, no doubt, entertaining and stimulating evening. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Jeff for, geez, 20 years, a little bit less. And it was a fateful dinner in Palo Alto, I think, where he invited me to finally get a PhD, which I've been wrestling with for years. Like, oh, I'm gonna get a PhD. No, I don't want to get a PhD. I'm too lazy. I don't want to apply. I don't want. And he's like, no, you got to come. You got to come. And so I can thank him and blame him for a PhD and my book High Weirdness. But it was great just to be able to be in Jeff's energy field because he's a very peculiar scholar in the sense that he does really far out stuff in a far out way that is quite challenging to the dominant tones and attitudes of humanities scholarship. And yet somehow he really gets away with it. And has so far is well, very well respected. And one of his secret gifts to the world that I haven't heard people thank him enough for is that he's very consciously using his visibility and his authority as an umbrella under which all sorts of weird scholars and pseudo scholars and weirdos can flourish. And he's very, very good at supporting community, which is one of the things we're kind of trying to do here at the Alembic, which is to create a community around this kind of stuff outside of scholarship, at the edge of scholarship, somewhere in the margins that Jeff's work explores in many, many different domains, from the history of mysticism to UFOs and superheroes to the history of the paranormal. And his books and his many, many books, wonderful writer. If you haven't read him, please do. You'll really enjoy it. But as the years have gone by, they've gotten tougher and tougher. It's like we're not taking it anymore. They get weirder and weirder. No holds barred in terms of taking a paranormal stance vis-a-vis our fading consensus reality. So tonight, tonight we're going to hear a little bit from his forthcoming book, How to Think Impossibly. And so he'll read for or talk and read for a bit, and then I'll come on and we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So welcome, Jeff Kripal.
Thank you very much. So I thought maybe I would just say a few words about Eric, because you may not hear that. And so I can do some dirt on Eric first. And then I'll talk a bit about myself, and not really myself, but why I do what I think Eric just articulated so well, and how I think it might be related to what you're trying to do here. And then I'll talk about the new book, and then I want to do a reading from it, which will, I think, illustrate what I mean by thinking impossibly, because I think that's what we should be doing now. I convinced Eric to get a PhD. I really think I did that. I think I kind of ruined his life, but not so much. I remember trying to convince him to come, telling people they have to move from San Francisco to Houston. That's not easy. And we somehow did it. And Eric was great and was really a colleague, not really a student. And I just want to thank him for giving up 3 or 4 years of your life there to come out of the Bay into Texas. So thank you. I think I want to say something about what Eric articulated and why I do what I do, because I think it will help. My experience talking is that if I talk about my ideas in the abstract, people look at me like I have 3 heads. Yeah, maybe you won't. Maybe you're like, yeah, that's right. But most people do. Most people think I'm nuts. But when I locate those ideas in the context of a life, people are like, oh, so that's why you think what you think. That makes a lot of sense, and they can sort of grok it, or they can sort of relate to it in a way that they couldn't before. Um, I grew up in the Midwest, in Nebraska. Actually, I grew up way east of here. I grew up in the '60s and '70s. I grew up with comic books. I grew up. That was all we had. Actually, we didn't have psychedelics. We didn't. We had a little rock and roll. We didn't have any Asian religion, but we had comics, and comics was the counterculture of the '60s and '70s. Not now. Now it's sort of making billions of dollars. Then it was inappropriate. It's kind of like Mad Magazine, slightly inappropriate. Um, and then I got really, really religious. And there were lots of reasons for that. But I mean, I got really religious. And I wanted to become a monk. And I joined a monastic seminary, and I spent 4 years in this Catholic seminary, and I learned a lot. I learned that people are religious for a lot of reasons that they're not aware of. Um, and particularly young Catholic men um, are religious for reasons that they're not aware of, but that the monks were really trying to make us aware of. And I really admired that. It's really, really where I learned psychoanalysis. It's where I started to read some Feuerbach and some philosophy. And it was a great education. Um, in the late 80s and early 90s, I went to graduate school and I did an MA and a PhD at the University of Chicago in something called the history of religions, which is a particular area within the study of religion that really focuses on extreme or extraordinary religious experience. It really privileges, I think, what most people would think of as mystical experience. And so I learned to think about religion in ways that I was really not encouraged to think about religion growing up in Nebraska. And it wasn't that people were censorious or, it wasn't that they were trying to be bad or anything. It was just that we just didn't, comparison was like you were either Lutheran or you were Catholic, but you were all German. That was kind of the extent of human diversity in this little town. And I got to the seminary and suddenly we were studying Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists. And I got to Chicago and suddenly we were living in India and China and, everywhere. So diversity was taken, and I mean real diversity. I mean real human religious diversity was like lesson numero uno, really. And so we were encouraged to think about religion in this broad kind of comparative way. And I found that really exciting. I also found it really scandalous and problematic from the perspective of my family back in the Midwest, who I think would have been shocked and horrified by 98% of the things that we just said every day in the classroom. It was just kind of, it's the water the fish swim in. But I felt this growing abyss between what goes on in a classroom or what goes on in a university and then what my family or the people think in the Midwest, just to kind of put it bluntly. There was kind of this sort of cultural polarity that opened up that I felt very keenly. My early work, and this gets a little difficult, my early work was on male sexual orientation and ecstatic religious experience in Hinduism. And my first book was essentially banned in India and debated in Parliament. And I became kind of the poster child for the evil Western white colonialist scholar who was making everything up, apparently. That's what they said. Of course, I wasn't making anything up. I was just trying to understand the text. And it was these texts that were saying all these things, and I was simply translating them. And it was crazy. It was wild. And I was pretty much alone. There weren't other American scholars of Hinduism that were targeted like this in the 90s. But there were people in New Testament studies. There were people in the study of Islam. There were people in the study of Sikhism. There were people in the study of Native American religions. There were other scholars that were being targeted. And we sort of constituted this group of harassed intellectuals, really. It was really, really bad. I really want to really stress that. We're not talking about a bad review or somebody saying, we're talking about threats, and we're talking about people not being allowed to enter countries, and books confiscated at borders, and we're talking about real political stuff that was happening. And this was all in the 90s, right? So the internet was just coming online, as it were, but nobody knew what was happening, and the intellectuals were at fault. We were clearly just saying something wrong or doing something, and we were somehow the perpetrators instead of what we actually were in some sense victims. This is where it's coming to California now. I had to get out of India, and I had to get out of the study of Hinduism because I wasn't going to survive there. I wasn't going to survive emotionally. I wasn't going to survive professionally. I literally was not going to be able to go back. So I came to California at the invitation of Michael Murphy, the co-founder of the Esalen Institute down in Big Sur, who had read the same book that was being banned and, of course, loved it because it's actually a very loving, very appreciative book, actually. So I was finding this community that was embracing what I was trying to do in the book in California. At the same time, I was being literally demonized and really canceled in some way in India and in the US. And so I started to come out here, and I've probably come out to Big Sur 60 or 70 times now over the course of my life, and probably lived there a couple of years by now. I've taught there for months at a time, and we've probably held 50 or 60 of these CTR events. So I help run the place now, and I help think about these issues, in Big Sur, and I wrote a big history of the place, which is really a history of the counterculture. It's really a history of the Bay Area, psychedelics, Asian religions, American counterculture in the 60s and 70s. And so that's really what got me here, got me to California for sure. It also leads into what we're going to talk about, I hope, tonight, because what happened was I came out here a lot. I lived here, and I just was talking to people. When people ask me, why do you study weird things? I say, well, it's the people. It's about human beings at the end of the day. And I started to hear story after story after story that I knew could not have happened, but that I knew happened, right? Because I knew these people, and I knew they weren't bullshitting me, as we say in the Midwest. And I know what bullshit is. I know what it feels like. And it's literal bullshit. You literally step in it, and it's not a good thing. And I knew it. I could smell bullshit when people are bullshitting me. These people were not bullshitting me. And they were telling me one weird thing after another. And I was like, wow. Well, if these things are happening in 2005 or 2007, they certainly could have happened in the 1st century in Palestine, or, the 6th century before the Common Era in Greece or North India or wherever it was. And it just sort of blew my mind, because when in the study of religion in the academy, believe it or not, we're trained not to think about these things. We're trained to ignore all the weird shit because clearly they just made it up. It's legendary, or they're saying these things to accrue power or authority or whatever they're doing. But clearly these things don't happen, right? But apparently they do. And so I was hearing these stories, and I was like, well, why don't we talk about these things in the humanities, which is the world I lived in? Why do we keep saying they don't happen when they clearly happen? And so I got really interested in this problem from a kind of intellectual history angle, kind of a nerdy angle. And I wrote a lot of books on it. I wrote a book called Authors of the Impossible, which is really an intellectual history of the paranormal that started out, by the way, in the universities. Started out among scientists and historians and philosophers in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then it migrated into popular culture and got basically expelled from the academy over the course of the 20th century. And there was this kind of renaissance in the last 10 or 20 years of intellectuals trying to think these things through and bring them back. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to help. And I was also worried about, frankly, my graduate students. I mean, Eric saw this. I worry a lot about, well, can these people get jobs? Can, someone comes and spends 6 or 7 or 8 years with us, what do they do, the PhD? Because the culture clearly doesn't care, and there are only some aspects of thought and scholarship that are rewarded and that people can get jobs for. And so I got really concerned about that. And I think that's kind of what you're picking up about trying to create an umbrella for people who want to study weird things. And so that's what I do now is I try to help particularly young people who are really fascinated by all of this stuff, think about them in a way that can be recognized by other intellectuals and by potential employers, and that they can frankly get jobs, something really practical. That's really what I try to do. And I've been really fortunate. I've had good editors. And by editors, I don't mean copy editors or line. I don't mean someone who corrects your grammar. I have those too. I mean acquisition editors who are, for those of you not in the publishing world, are extremely powerful people. It's really the acquisition editors who determine what gets published and what doesn't. And if you're an academic working on strange things like myself, it could be really, your career could be very short. Let me put it that way. But I've been fortunate to have editors who really, frankly, believe in what I'm trying to do. And so it's like, okay, Jeff, what's the next book? What are you doing now? And that's not generally how the academy works. And this book coming out in the spring, it's called How to Think Impossibly. And they pushed me on a subtitle. The subtitle is about, the word literally about, souls, UFOs, time, belief, and everything else. And that's really what the book's about, is how to think about these things in a way that I hope is rigorous and academic and historical, but is also, I think, beyond all of those things. And I'll explain why. I was asked to write this book essentially by my editor, a man named Kyle Wagner. I wrote a book with him last year called The Superhumanities. And it's really an argument that the humanities are cool. The humanities are filled with the altered states and weird experiences of historical intellectuals that then produce the ideas that then become the ideas of the humanities. And we've sort of forgotten all that. We've forgotten how weird these people were and how extraordinary their lives were, because they themselves often hid that because they weren't supposed to have these experiences, but they did. And it's these experiences that generated a lot of their ideas. And those are the ideas we still teach and think about, even though we've lost that sort of weird background. So that's what that book was about. And it's a very nerdy book. It's for other academics. I had spent 4 years in a dean's office as an associate dean, really thinking about the humanities as a whole, the university as a whole. I was watching people get hired. I was dealing with a lot of disciplinary cases. I was sort of looking at the academy from the inside, and I was seeing the STEM fields sort of prosper, and I was seeing the humanities not prosper. And I was like, why is that? What's going on here? Because the humanities are really the superhuman. They're cool, but the humanists weren't saying that. They were making things more and more depressing and smaller. And so I wrote that book to try to just goad my colleagues. And what happened was Kyle said to me, he said, "Okay, Jeff, but how do you do the superhumanities? How do you do this? Like, how do you actually do this?" He didn't want just another book about theory or vision. He wanted a more kind of practice manual. And so I wrote How to Think Impossibly. And the book is really, it's a how-to manual on how to think impossibly, just what it says. And I think what I want to do now is I want to just go through some of the conclusion. There's five ways to think how to think impossibly, and I want to share those with you. And then I want to do a reading from it, which is in many ways the best part because it's not about me. It's about Stuart Davis, actually. It's about a gigantic mantis. I'll just give the story away, who really shows up and does some really strange things to Stuart. And it's a good example of what I mean by thinking impossibly. Okay. So how do we do this? So I use this phrase, how are we ontologically shocked? Does anybody know where the phrase ontological shock comes from? Have you heard it recently? It's been in the news recently. David Grush has been using it a lot. The whistleblower, the UFO retrieval guy in the Pentagon, he's been using this phrase ontological shock. And he's clearly getting it from someone. But you know who he's getting it from? John Mack. He's getting it from John Mack. John was a psychiatrist at Harvard who won a Pulitzer Prize for a biography of T.H. Lawrence. And then he got really interested. He came to Esalen. He made the mistake of going to Esalen. Bad move, always a bad move. And it kind of blew his mind. And he got really interested in abductees. And he started to work with abductees. And it just blew his mind. He realized that none of the things people were saying about abductees are actually true. They're not mentally ill. They're not exaggerating. They're actually telling the truth as best they have it. And Harvard responded. You know how Harvard responded to this? Does anybody know this story? Harvard responded by trying to fire John Mack. They tried to take away his tenure and sue him on the basis of medical malpractice was the charge, essentially. And a court case ensued for about 1.5 years, and Mack and his legal team fought Harvard over this, and Harvard finally backed down. And then John was killed in 2004 by a drunk driver in London. But the phrase ontological shock goes back to Mack, who made it famous in the 90s. And his argument was essentially this, that if you take these abduction experiences seriously, and he did, the scientific paradigm actually doesn't work. But neither does the religious paradigm. That there's something else going on here. And what the abductees are actually most reporting is this notion of ontological shock. They're shocked that things are not what they were told. The reality wasn't what they thought it was. And their experiences are manifesting in these extremely bizarre or even absurd ways. But at the base of this is this notion of ontological shock. The phrase, as I've since learned, goes actually back to a Protestant theologian named Paul Tillich, who first used it, believe it or not, in like the 1960s. And it was also used, by the way, in the film The Matrix. It was used as a song for the soundtrack for The Matrix. They probably got it from John Mack, but they might have got it from Tillich. I don't know yet. So anyway, the point of what's my point? What's your point, Jeff? The point is that the point of all this is to be shocked ontologically, to understand that when people are talking about their experiences, what they're actually moved by is not some symbolic or metaphorical claim they're really shocked by the reality of it and how it doesn't fit into their previous reality. I think there are 5 ways to be so shocked, and this is what the book is about. The first way I just call the impossible, and the impossible is a very simple idea. It's that impossibility is a function of your worldview. It's actually not a function of reality. That what you think is impossible or possible is simply a function of how you were raised, the language you speak, and the culture you embody. And you mistake all of those for reality, but actually that's not reality. And if you study religion, impossible things are happening all the time. So the first rule in how to think impossibly is really, I suppose, to think historically or comparatively, and to understand that what you think of as reality, impossible and impossible, is not reality. That's just the way you were raised. The second rule is actually is kind of inspired by Eric's work. I call it "Get Weird," and what I mean by this is to take people's experiences seriously, regardless of how bizarre or absurd or strange they seem. And there are countless ways we do not take people's experiences seriously. We will say, oh, they're mentally ill, or, oh, they're making this up, or, oh, I believe that you believe that. If you talk to an experiencer, that's obviously a dismissal of their experience. And so the rule here is to don't, to invoke Wouter Hanegraaff, who's in the room here with us, don't take anything off the table. Leave it on the table. All of it, not some of it, not the stuff you like, not the stuff that makes you comfortable or that affirms your reality, but leave it all on there. And let's see what happens. Okay? So that's the second rule is and you'll see me do this in the reading, because a lot of, I'll just give you a good example of this. It's in the news right now. The UFO thing, or the UAP as they like to call it. They want to, Congress and these whistleblowers keep pretending or saying, I don't think the whistleblowers really actually believe this, but they say it's all about spaceships in the sky, or it's all about technology, it's all about machines, it's all about science and technology. It's very STEMmy if you listen to it. And the argument is it's about national security and basically everything we know in this military world is through these radar cameras in fighter jets that are designed to do one thing: shoot it down. And so there's this very, very STEMmy physical kind of thing going on in Congress right now. But if you actually look at the material, what you realize very quickly is that UFO encounters get very strange very quickly. Monsters show up, people have precognitive dreams, aliens show up, they speak telepathically to people, time and space get warped. I mean, all kinds of weird shit happens, and it all gets taken away. All of it gets just lopped off in this conversation that's going on right now. And so that's a really good example of what I mean by keeping it weird. The third rule is look up. And by look up, I mean, and this is really more to my academic colleagues, take transcendence seriously. By transcendence, I mean some experience or reality that is not of your social experience or your physical embodiment, something that is outside you entirely. I've sat on a lot of dissertation committees at Rice, including Eric's. This didn't happen on yours, but on so many dissertations, somebody will have a text or a thinker that's affirming some form of transcendence, and it always gets reduced to something social or political or moral. It never stands, ever. So this notion of transcendence, I think, is really important, and it doesn't mean I'm proposing a transcendent worldview, but it means, again, we have to keep that on the table, and I don't think we do. The fourth rule is called more real than real. It's simply to realize that when people explain these experiences, they're not talking about metaphors. They're not talking about belief. They're talking about something that actually happened to them. And the phrase they use a lot is more real than real. That whatever this was, it was more real than the reality we're in right now. The fifth rule is it's time. And I mean that in a kind of double sense. I think it's about time. Not, I mean that in the English sense of it's about time, but I also mean it's really about time. And I think if you look at particularly the UFO thing again, most of our frameworks are spatial frameworks. Like you'll hear this endlessly. Oh, there can't be aliens because they can't get from here to there in this amount of time. It's a spatial kind of thinking. But if you just switch it to a temporal framework, suddenly a lot of this stuff makes sense. And by temporal, I don't mean A, B, C. Sometimes I mean C, B, A. People have experiences that are not temporally or causally conditioned. They have dreams of things that are going to happen the next day, or the next week, or the next year. They experience the future. They remember the future, and the future plays out exactly as they remember it. So clearly, what we think of as time is not this linear causal thing that fits into our very STEMmy materialist worldview. It operates in ways in human experience that violate, I think, a lot of what we assume to be the case. Okay, so those are the 5 rules. Now let me read this, Eric, and then hopefully the interesting part can begin, and you can talk to me. This is a little section from the new book called Man Meets Mantis, which I did not come up with. That's Stuart Davis's title. Stuart Davis, by the way, for those of you who don't know Stuart Davis, he's a very funny man. He's a literal comedian. I mean, a professional comedian. He's also a singer-songwriter. And he's had a lot of these extraordinary, impossible experiences that he's tried to talk about on a podcast called Aliens and Artists, which I strongly, strongly recommend. Aliens and Artists. And his basic argument, which is my argument as well, is that what the impossible is really about is creativity. That it pushes people to think in new ways and to create culture in new ways, and therefore to create human beings in a new way. Okay, so you'll see this all come out here. Okay, so this is from the book. Allow me to say something more specific now about the recent transformation of the imaginal as it morphs back into some entomological forms in the contemporary UFO and abduction literatures. And just to kind of footnote that, the word imaginal is a word that's used a lot in the study of religion to refer to things that are imagined but not imaginary. And it actually goes back to 19th century entomology. It referred to the imaginal state of an insect, which was the adult form, as opposed to the larval form, which was the mushy, wormy stage. So the imaginal is this perfect insect, as it were, in 19th century entomology. And it reappears, was used to think about psychical or paranormal experiences in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it reappears in modern abduction accounts literally as an insect. And I think there's some kind of connection here, but I don't know what it is yet. Stuart Davis is a spiritual seeker, exceptionally well-versed in the American spiritual and Buddhist scenes, and a full-time artist who has worked in music, television, film, and language. And by language, I mean he invented his own language out of this experience. Stuart has recounted and shared his encounter and UFO experiences at some length in a number of places, foremost among them an audio salvo, Man Meets Mantis, which is episode 0 of his remarkable podcast series on the relationship between non-ordinary experiences and artistic creativity, aliens and artists. Much of what I describe below is based closely on that particular oral transmission, but it is also shaped and guided by conversations I have had with Stewart over the years, including on aliens and artists, and with a most remarkable group of individuals of the Experiencer Group, the latter, led by co founders Kirsten Blackburn, J. Christopher King, and Davis himself, is a sophisticated collective of individuals from all walks of life who create community and smart conversation around superhuman experiences, often of the high strange type. I happen to think that the basic thesis of the Aliens and Artists podcast series, namely that creativity and paranormal experiences are deeply related, is perfectly correct. I was especially surprised by the story of Bobby. Stewart tells us that Bobby was staying at a friend's house in Aspen in the late 1990s. Sometime between 3:30 and 4 in the morning, his mind woke up, but his body was completely paralyzed. Beside the bed was a 6 or 7 foot mantis, ghost like, that is not quite physically there, but there, another life form. Bobby was in what he called a fear state. The altered state lasted for about 5 minutes before Bobby gained control over his limbs again and the terror subsided. Bobby had this sense that the mantis was taking samples of his emotional, subtle, and causal bodies. He jokes that whereas Stewart was issued onto a long artistic life path by his encounter, all he got from his was a blood pressure reading. Joke aside, thank you for laughing at my joke. I am personally stunned by Bobby's experience because it replicates in near perfect phenomenological detail what happened to me in one early morning in Calcutta in November of 1989. Unlike Bobby, though, the results of what I call that night were far more than a blood pressure reading. The result was a lifetime of scholarship, including this book. I saw no such insectoid entity in that literally shocking event. I initially thought I was being electrocuted. Even if Kali, literally the black one, the Hindu tantric goddess whom I was trying to understand at the time, is sometimes compared to a spider with 8 arms. Still, there was no visual content. Okay, it felt like I was having sex with a many-armed super spider. Maybe I was, but I saw no such thing. Vision or no, the experience convinced me quite completely that non-ordinary encounters can result in new forms of insight, wild intuition, and powerful creativity that lie at the very core of some types of cultural production, including, believe it or not, nerdy scholarship. It happened to me. I am who I am. I think how I think because of that night. Bobby's story is more than just a story for me. Something like sleep paralysis does not do it either. No doubt that physiological condition is what let it in, but it says little or nothing at all about what came in. Here is Stewart's story. Very much unlike me, he saw the thing. At midnight on the eve of the new year, 2010, Davis had, excuse me, I just need a drink. Davis had what he called, quote, the strangest experience of my life, unquote. He was meditating in a high fever, a physiological pattern he had had as a small child and grew to appreciate as, quote, glimpses into another reality, unquote, before the pattern receded in his teen years. The fever was back. He decided to do what he had learned as a practicing Buddhist, meditate through it. He also decided to set an intention. He asked to meet his spiritual guides. That seemed reasonable enough. Stewart was expecting dead Buddhist monks, or perhaps some lesser Buddhist deities, maybe a bodhisattva. You know, something traditional and respectable. Nope. Instead, Stewart found himself face to face with an 8-foot tall praying mantis entity, basically a gigantic insectoid, who was wearing a purple cloak with a high collar, no less. Thank you for laughing. It is funny. Stewart was shocked. Literally, the mantis shot a powerful signal into him. It was, quote, like being hit by an invisible fire hose, unquote. The signal was as sonic as it was shocking, since it was, quote, like being hit. I'm sorry, was filled with. I'm sorry. The signal was as sonic as it was shocking, since it was filled with inexplicable data, quote, clicks, pops, something akin to music, all nonverbal, unquote. Then, as it ended, a thought lands in his head, telepathic style, as is often the case in these alien abduction experiences. Stewart hears a single sentence in English now: remember who you work for. Then it was over. He hadn't watched the episode, by the way, for those of you who are, that's a Breaking Bad line, by the way. He apparently had never seen it. Then it was over. The whole thing lasted maybe 1 minute. That was enough. But it did not end exactly there. It just went on and on and on as the insectoid or imaginal presence entered the daily lives of Stewart, his family, and soon enough his professional colleagues, resulting in what he calls super synchronicities, mostly with what else? Praying mantis insects. These super synchronicities in the social and biological worlds are what made it so difficult, impossible really, to take the easy way out and read the mantis as his higher spiritual self, or as some kind of bizarre psychospiritual projection, the debunker's rhetorical ploy of hallucination. What to do with all the physical events, with history, as academics like to say, as if they know how that works. These were not just dreams or internal altered states, these were very physical and often literally entomological events. The praying mantis insects, for example, began showing up at key moments to and around very specific individuals, including a number of artists, a producer, a director, a cinematographer, a line editor, working on a trilogy of films, a trilogy, by the way, that Stewart firmly believes that he wrote out of the signals shot into his body that night. The opening scene of the first film features a teenage victim of human trafficking, a young Russian woman who is about to murder her captor when she finds a praying mantis insect that triggers what Stewart calls a paranormal awakening. He saw the whole movie in his head, and he knew who would play its lead when he met her, the British-Russian singer-songwriter Jasmine Karamova. Stewart wrote the abstract for the film script and then set it aside, laughing that, quote, no one will want to make a paranormal sex trafficking movie in Russia, unquote. Well, that wasn't true. The scripts were purchased, the mantids kept showing up, and the movies are half-funded now. Indeed, the physical insects showed up so much that Stewart began to wonder if they were not somehow the eyes of the gigantic forms, one of which he encountered and later learned live in some other dimension to which we cannot go as physical bodies and communicate with us through synchronicities and the presence of the insects themselves. This, anyway, is what he was told when he tried to channel the mantis at the advice of a local female shaman. And this was all before Stewart met Jacqueline Smith, who revealed at a UFO conference that she had been visited by mantis beings at 12 noon on, get this, New Year's Eve. She also claims to have mantis DNA. She suggested that Stewart himself was a mantis in a past life in another dimension, that is, between the physical and the spiritual realms. To quote Stewart's exact response, what the actual fuck? The exclamations and laughter go on as Stewart recounts many other things that happened around these extraordinary events. An intelligent UFO appeared in the day sky and was witnessed by Stewart's daughter and wife as it moved and mind melded with him. A locked door swung open and lights flickered in a house for a producer reading the script before she encountered a praying mantis eating a dragonfly at her door the next morning. A massive tuning fork and then hearing test sound vibrated over the family house. Such a sound had a deeply personal and autobiographical meaning for Davis, while coyotes wailed in the distance to announce the appearance and departure of the sounds. A family dog refused to investigate while his ears perked up to the eeriness. One can imagine what the dog was thinking. No way, human. I ain't going up there. And as if that were not enough, Stewart tells us of an old scoop mark in his left leg and a BB like lump in his shoulder. Possible physical implants as quintessential imaginal or mental material technologies. Typical stuff. Yes, Stewart knows, and he swears again to get the point across. It's all a labyrinthine mindfuck. Stewart does not dismiss the craziness, he embraces it, and then tries to think with it. Part of this thinking with is his awareness of the deep historical etymologies that seem to be at work in such moments. He knows, for example, that the word mantis is related to mantic, itself derived from the Greek mantikos, as relating to divination, as well as to mania, which comes from a Greek verb for to be made mad. We are back to the deepest sources of human civilization in inspired madness and altered states of consciousness. This is what Stuart Davis calls the primordial lineage that produced religion, philosophy, and civilization itself. It is superhuman to the core. Okay, thank you. All right.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of questions, and I don't know where to start. I do want to share, this is so mild compared to Stewart's, but it still pops up in my head. It was like 1994, and I was giving a talk at Arco Sante, and it was, remember, it was more the late 90s, and it was a pretty peculiar crew of planetary cosmic thinkers. And I was just riffing on technology in the future, and it was his Technosis days. And just at the moment I started talking about aliens, just when I invoked the UFO, this praying mantis came right on stage, just landed right like this on this thing right here, just like sit there and like. It was delightful. Luckily or not, most of my synchros are kind of mild that way. I don't get hit over the head too often. But
that's not very mild.
Yeah. Well, that's what you're saying. So I think I want to start out again. I want to ask some kind of humanities stuff, and then get to the weirder shit with an interesting problem in the superhumanities, and particularly in the study of comparative mysticism. So here's the problem. We've talked about it before. So out there, there's a thing called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, the MEQ. And this has become a very important thing in psychedelic science, because the famous Johns Hopkins 2006 paper declaring what we all know, that psilocybin mushrooms can occasion mystical experience, is based on being able to test the people who have these experiences, and they give them this test, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And so it says, was it ineffable? Did you experience a sense of timelessness? Did you whatever. It goes through this sort of series of questions that you say yes or no to, and if you have enough yeses, then it counts as a mystical experience. And we laugh because it's kind of silly, but that's how social science works. And as a trained historian of mysticism, I can look at this and go, this is just bullshit. Where did you get this idea? And then you go back, like, where did this test come from? Okay, well, there's this guy, William Stace, and Stace has read James, and he's got this other thing going. And you can see, as a historian, the construction of this concept of mysticism, which is, as they like to say, as they love to say, as they can't stop saying, problematic from multiple angles. It's colonialist, it's abstract, it's this and that, it's like crypto-Christian, all the things you can say about it. So there it is, sitting there at the heart of the renaissance of psychedelia, this kind of like awkward thing. And I remember having a conversation with Roland Griffiths, who ran the program, going, hey, Roland, it's kind of flimsy, like this whole thing, and there's a lot of problems with it, and it's not going to work as some kind of measure of reality. And he just didn't get it. Like, he didn't get where I was coming from. And I was like, I felt the gap between the two cultures.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, and this is my question, on the one hand, I want to deconstruct this concept, which I think actually represses the multiplicity of psychedelic experiences, and it kind of sorts of try to squeeze it into something to have certain effects that I don't, I don't buy in some ways. But on the other hand, since that has come out, you have a wave of psychedelic scientists who sit there and go, why are we even screwing around with this word mysticism? We can do everything we need to do without even touching any of this stuff. It's just a messy word. It's just a vague concept. We got to measure it scientifically. We have all the terms we need. And so I realized that my impulse as a scholar to problematize this construct, which is not just sort of wrong, but actually a little bit kind of bad in some of its effects, is in some ways just handing it over to the scientists who want to say, yeah, just don't even deal with that stuff. Just let's just stay on neurons and da 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 da. So there is an interesting problem in the kind of superhumanities. What do we do with this term mysticism? Do we keep it around? That I'd like to hear how you think about that.
Yeah, I think about that a lot actually, and I know Roland, and I know a lot of those they're all psychiatrists who run that program at Johns Hopkins. I have a lot to say about that. It's kind of connected. First of all, the word paranormal is like the. We don't have any words that are not abused words. That's the first thing I would say. They're all bad. All words are fucked up. Okay? And academics are really good at explaining to you why they're fucked up. Okay? But we still need words. We still need to talk about things. And I think an intellectual or a writer at their best is someone who helps us use language in a better or more poetic or more provocative. I think you do this, Eric. I don't think the psychiatrists or the STEM people do, by the way. I think the questionnaires and that whole social scientific method is exactly the wrong way to go about understanding what's at stake here and what's actually happening. I never use the word mysticism. I don't like it. It's clunky. I will use the adjective mystical because I think it's a perfectly good word and it evokes something. I tend not to use the word paranormal, even though it has a really philosophically nuanced history. It was coined in 1903 by a French psychologist lawyer to basically explain things that happen and that don't fit into our present scientific paradigm, but are part of the natural world. So it was very much moving away from the traditional category of the supernatural, but it then gets taken up, and now you go to Barnes and Noble and you go to the paranormal romance section. It evokes vampires and sexy men with no shirts is basically what it evokes. And so I don't use it. I use the impossible. So I think there are ways that humanists and writers can be very useful here. I think with the Johns Hopkins study and the psychedelic research in general, I think, frankly, they need to hire historians and humanists and philosophers. The questionnaire, as you explained, is based on William Stace and Houston Smith. And I told Roland, too. I said, Roland, what would you do if you read a paper and the last literature they cited was 60 years ago? He said, well, I wouldn't take it seriously. Well, what do you think I think when I read your paper? And you've only read William Stace and Houston Smith. A lot happened since 1955 or 1960, and we can do what you're doing, and we can still affirm this sort of the ontological shock of these experiences, but we can be way more sophisticated about it. The other thing I think that the Johns Hopkins or the psychedelic researchers are doing is they're taking things off the table. They want these substances like psilocybin to treat clinical depression or hopefully veterans. It's always veterans that they're treating PTSD or something. And this is how they're going to get these things legalized. But in fact, all kinds of really bizarre things are happening when you give somebody psilocybin, the door's off. And I've had people in that study say to me, Jeff, this person had sex with a gigantic spider that was God. Do you think that entered the report? I'm like, no, I don't think so. Like, no, it didn't. it got sliced out. And so that's what I'm talking about is we have to take in the gigantic god sexual spiders along with becoming one with the universe and the beneficent force or ground of reality. It's all part of the experience. And I don't think we're there. I think
Mhm.
we're just sort of scratching the surface, or we're just trying to open that door of legalization so we can use these substances again in some kind of therapeutic setting. So I think their intentions are good. I mean, I've talked to them. I know those people. I think their intentions as psychiatrists is to get the substances legalized and to get them into the
Yeah.
culture that way. And talking about all these complexities and these historical matters is a great way not to do
Yeah.
that. I understand that, but I still think it's part of the experience.
Right. Right.
And I don't think we're ever going to understand it with a social scientific questionnaire. I think it's the absolute
Yeah.
worst way to this third person objectifying STEM approach is precisely what this is not about. It's about a first person subjective ecstatic experience of the subject. It's not about something you could measure and quantify.
Yeah.
And I think that just really offends them ontologically because they, in their minds, and I don't say this in a negative way, but in their minds, if something's real, it's quantifiable and it's measurable. If you can't quantify it and measure it, it's not real. Okay? That's their definition of reality that they get from their scientific method. And the scientific method works, but it's a pragmatic tool. It doesn't tell us what things are, it tells us how things work. And those are two very different questions.
Yeah. Right. Indulge me with one more question about psychedelics, because I'm interested. In your work, you have noted this phenomenon, and I think you're actually part of it. In the Archives of the Impossible, which is a archive at Rice University that Jeff put together with some great contributions from Whitley Strieber and other major figures in the field, and it's really a remarkable, important collection. That the how the best way to say it is that there seems to be a resurgence, that we are in an increasingly, to use paranormal turn in
Yeah.
popular culture,
Yeah.
in people's discussions. I think for many people, the strongest ontological shock they're going to experience, people now, is often with psychedelics.
Yes.
So I'm curious, for you, having narrated and historicized these other currents, and having not written extensively or studied extensively the psychedelic field, how you see the role that the emerging psychedelic culture, importance of psychedelics, is playing in the larger project of putting these things back on the table.
Yeah. I think it's very influential in a historical way, but in a largely hidden way. In other words, I think a lot of the ideas that drive, for example, the counterculture, people came to them on psychedelics and then didn't talk about that. So I think there's this hidden kind of history of alternative religious ideas. Psychedelics. So here, let me speak as a doctoral Vater or a Dr. Vater, a mentor. So young people come to me all the time and they want to come to Rice and they want to be Professor Paranormal or they want to be Professor Psychedelic. And I say, no, you can't do that. And the reason you can't do that is because you won't get a job. It's not because I don't think that there should be a Professor Paranormal or a Professor Psychedelic. Of course I do. I think that should happen, but it just isn't the case now. And there is a movement in the American Academy to create something called the Psychedelic Humanities, including at Johns Hopkins, by the way. I see a lot of hope in that, but honestly and frankly, I'm speaking from the dean's office now, that we need money to do that. And I say that in utter honesty. I mean, look, you want to know how the sciences work? It's money. And if you want this to work, it's money. It's like we need tens of millions of dollars to produce chairs and to produce research that is intergenerational, and we need to create this momentum. Anything else is it's just a one-off. It just does. It's not going to work
Hmm.
culturally. And I've looked at funding. I mean, this was my job as associate dean. The funding for the sciences opposed to the humanities in the U.S. is 50-1. Okay, 50-1. And the research in the humanities, by the way, is very cheap. If even if it was 30-1, great. We could do a lot with that. But 50-1 it basically means they're slicing off the humanities because it's not scientific, it's not measurable, it's not quantifiable. You can't get the whatever society it is to fund you.
Yeah.
And I told Roland this too. I told him the same thing. I'm like, Roland, hire an expert on mystical literature. And he said, I tried, and they cut it all out of the grant. That's what he told me. So that's what happens. That's what literally happens in the real world is you just get cut out.
Yeah. Well, one of my hopes is just that presuming that these things spread and more people coming at them for reasons of healing and without a interest in bizarre experiences and who are exposed to psychedelics, and some of them are going to have these opening experiences and these ontological shocks, that in the wake of that, it will become overwhelmingly evident that we need other kinds of tools to be able to deal with that.
Again, maybe like
psychiatry.
Like take the UFO UAP thing. I mean, it's all over Congress now, and it's in the military and in the intelligence communities, but they're weaponizing it.
Mm-hmm.
They're literally weaponizing it. And they want money to further weaponize it. Well, but that's not what an abduction experience is about. That's not what an encounter is about. Is there a negative component? You bet there is. Is that getting talked about? Too much.
Right.
So there is there's this way that these subjects get picked up by the culture that's well funded and taken in a very bad direction. And I'm sure psychedelics could be badly taken up as well.
Yeah. So I want to ask you another question, partly from the perspective of the alembic, where things that you could call, even if in a fairly traditional sense, tantric, go down, is that both from your own experience, where your transformative encounter occurs, at least in the context of your studies of the tantric tradition, and then when after you leave that field and you're talking about Esalen and the counterculture in particular, you talk about the tantric transmission, and I think actually one of the most important things in that book is showing how historically, but also phenomenologically, there really is a kind of transmission from Eastern teachers, Asian teachers to the West through a variety of means that actively informs the counterculture, and that I think informs not just obvious forms of alternative spirituality, but also some of the more crazy informal stuff, that it's a certain kind of energetic, erotic, mystical, juicy, ancient thing that's happening. So what I guess I would ask is, from your even, and it's not a dominant tone in your more recent work, you don't really, it's there, but it's not like what you're pointing to. How's the tantric transmission doing now?
I mean, there's a backlash for one thing, right? So in the 60s and so this book Eric's talking about, it's the book on Esalen, and one of its basic arguments is that there's this shift in how Americans received Hindu and Buddhist ideas. That before 1950, it's very ascetic, it's very Vedantic, it's very monastic, frankly. And that after 1950, you get this gradual shift. Starts with the beat poets, actually, but it also goes through the whole counterculture and Kundalini and the chakras and all this. This is all tantric language, if you know anything about these Asian cultures. And it goes further and further into this, what I call this tantric transmission. And I call it a tantric transmission because, I mean, there are gurus literally going around touching people and sending them into the stratosphere. They're literally transmitting these energies into people. And this is in Florida, California. I mean, it's all through the country. So this is an actual transmission going on. And I think we still don't know what to do with that as a culture, nor do the Asian traditions, by the way, because they'll say, oh, this is a Kundalini awakening or these are the chakras. I'm like, it's bigger than that. Like one of the things I've noticed about alien abductions is that the abduction often starts with a tingling sensation at the bottom of the spine and results in an out-of-body experience. And if you know anything about Kundalini awakenings, that's exactly how a Kundalini awakening. So clearly something is happening in different cultural frameworks, but the physiology or the neurology or whatever that is the same. And it often has profound effects on sexuality in a really queer way. I mean, if you look at alien abduction accounts, they're about as sexual as you get. And that sex doesn't fit in to the social models that the abductees come in with it. So there's something about the abduction material that's like the tantric material. And if you know something about tantra, by the way, in South Asia, you know that a lot of it is based on female goddesses who come out of the sky and basically have sex with people. That's what tantra is in South Asia for millennia. And of course, this is what the UFO phenomenon is about. It's about weird beings coming out of the sky and having sex with people, right? So there's clearly some kind of related thing going on, but because we lack any kind of comparative framework, we'll say, oh, this is about Hinduism, or this is about UFOs, or this is, we get locked into a particular cultural framework and we don't look at it in this broader comparative way.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that you just performed in your last answer that I think is an interesting. Well, I'd just like to hear you have what do you got to say about it? Is, we all know that, it's a cultural construction, and this idea that like all these forms are just, they have to be seen in their local context, and that any kind of mechanism of comparison that you would invoke is a problem. So that the very way in which you would compare things across time and space is questioned. What could be the basis of it? And you threw out as a possible example, shared physiology. And so there's this interesting opportunity, and it's kind of funny because in a way, in order to ground a comparison in the body, particularly around energy and these transformative altered states, you got to invoke a body, and a body is like, in a way, the universal human body is also kind of an object of science, and that you're kind of leaning in a way a bit on, well, come on, we boil it down, guys, we know evolution, we're all sharing the same basic stuff, whereas a radical deconstruction would say, well, even that idea is like, we can't say that. So in a way, there's a kind of gesture towards a realistic object of science in order to ground some of this comparison, which is really important.
I was taught that in graduate school by Wendy Doniger, who was my own mentor. And Wendy was arguing against this sort of postmodern critique of comparativism already in the 1990s. And her argument was, well, you build comparison from the ground up, you build it from the body up. And you can talk about bodies across cultures and across times in a very reliable way. Yes, they're different. Yes, embodied experiences are all constructed in different ways, but everybody has a spine. People have brains, people have two arms, and there is a grounding of comparison. I would go further than that, though, Eric.
Yeah.
I would go further than Wendy, and probably that Wendy's comfortable with. What I personally think is that paranormal experiences are the building blocks of religion, because you can go to any culture at any time and you can find the exact same shit. You can find hauntings at midnight and chains in the attic in 7th century China or 19th century England. It doesn't matter. And those experiences, which are often literally outside the body, are very similar, and they're very different. Mm-hmm. And it's that both and that I think we have to somehow come to terms with and inhabit. I think the postmodern turn was really important. It taught us the differences, But I think we have to kind of get back to the yes, it's different, but it's also the same now, because otherwise there's nothing that joins us,
Mhm.
and we're just all floating out into separate communities.
Yeah. I want to switch a little bit and talk about something, and I haven't read all of your prolific writing, but I've read almost all of it. And I recently read The Flip, which is 2 books ago, and I highly recommend it to people who haven't read it because it's short, it's really to the point, and it's no holds barred. And one thing about it that it was interesting to me, and we don't really want to go into too much detail, though it's fascinating. I could totally nerd out with you about metaphysics. Is that you take a stop and you go, okay, look, if we really take these things seriously, then our fundamental ontology is wrong, and it must be something other than that.
Mhm.
So let's think about what the other things are,
Yeah.
particularly in the relationship between mind and matter, or body and mind.
Yeah.
And you go through, panpsychism and dual source and da da da. And you kind of, you have your opinions. You kind of land in a way. You're taking this. You're taking all of the anecdotes that or the stories that you've accumulated, and you're actually going, okay, let's go over here now. Was that something that kind of came to you later as you were doing this work, or did you go all the way back to the beginning and go, yeah, this mind body thing is not what we think it is. There's some kind of deeper connection. And then if you could explain a little bit about how you most naturally have come to think about that non-ordinary relationship.
Yeah. So there's two influences on that book. One is a woman named Erica Goldman, who's an editor. And Erica wrote a piece I wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is sort of the New York Times of the academic world. And it's called Visions of the Impossible. And it's an attempt to think about paranormal experiences as a humanist. And the argument of that little piece is that these experiences are central to human beings. And so they should be central to the study of human beings. Why are we ignoring them? And what happened was Erica, as an editor of a little boutique press in a hospital in New York that was founded by a cardiologist, actually, to bring the sciences and the humanities together, she read that piece and she contacted my literary agent, who contacted me. And she basically said, look, Jeff, I'm generally a skeptic about all of these things, but there was nothing in your piece that I couldn't agree with. Would you write a book on that? And I basically write for people. I liked Erica. And I said, yeah, I'll do that. And then I didn't. I had other things to do. I just ignored it. And Erica's like, come on, Jeff, you got to do this. I'm like, okay. So I wrote that book for Erica. So it's about bringing the sciences and the humanities in conversation. The other influence on it was my students at Rice, who are virtually all STEM students. They're going to be future engineers and work in the oil and gas industry, or they're going to be medical doctors, or they're going to be physicists. And I was teaching religion, comparative religion, to them. And I could just see, I couldn't see into their head, of course, but I could just see that I was using all of these traditional religious sources, and they were just waving them off with this idea that, well, they didn't know their science. If these people would have known their science, they wouldn't have these bizarre experiences. So I said to myself now, fuck you. Okay, that's the first thing I said. I'm not going to use weird old religious people anymore. I'm going to use Nobel laureates. I'm going to use physicists and medical doctors. Now let's see what you say. Okay? Well, that really changed the dynamic of the classroom, but that's also behind the flip, because what the flip is, if you look at it, is it's really a treatment of scientists and engineers and medical professionals who have life-changing experiences, and they flip. They abandon their earlier materialistic worldview and they adopt some kind of panpsychic or idealist worldview because it makes way more sense of their experiences. And they realize in the process that their medicine or their physics or their chemistry works just fine. That actually their discipline was never about the metaphysical interpretation. It was about the practical usefulness of the chemistry or the engineering. So I wrote that little book. I wrote it for Erica. Um, I also wrote it for my students at Rice, but I also wrote it because I was trying to reach more
Mhm.
people. As I've often joked, writing in the academy, it's like writing for 50 people in the world, 25 of whom hate you. And that's really what it's like. And writing the flip was like, okay, you're writing for 5,000 people now, 4,000 of whom like you, actually. There's some people who don't like you, actually, for writing a book like that.
Yeah.
Um, but generally, it's been really well received.
Good.
It had the misfortune. What happened with that book is it came out, just to give you a little insight into publishing history, it came out in 2018 or 19. And then Michael Pollan, of all people, was on tour in London, and they asked him what he was reading. And he just went off on the flip. It's like, oh my God, this thing's blowing my mind. And he went on and on and on about the flip. And Penguin was there, and they're like, whoa, wait a minute. And so they contacted us and they bought the rights to it. But here's the thing, it was released in the spring of 2020. Now, if you're a book publisher, you do not want to publish a book in the spring of 2020. I can guarantee that, because people are thinking about other things. They're thinking about dying, so they're thinking about. And it didn't. I don't think.
Right.
I don't think it did what they wanted it to do, but I think it's done fine, actually, as a book.
Yeah, yeah. When you talk about the flip, I mean, it's a great exploration of examples of people who you wouldn't expect to flip, who flip,
No.
and that's
A lot of
amazing.
them, by the way, are on psychedelics.
Yeah,
We're going back to the psychedelic topic. Well, Michael Pollan, of course, being one of them, who got Penguin to reissue it. But a lot of the subjects in the book actually flipped on psychedelics.
Yeah.
And they don't always tell you that,
right.
but they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another question there is that one of the other things we're seeing is a resurgence of in the last 10, 15 years is contemplative practice, contemplative recognized increasingly within the academy, more robust science, programs of contemplation in schools, but also out in the world. There's just more and more modes of it, including ones that are less and less informed by traditional religion. Do you think what role do you see that this sort of the contemplative practices, meditation related, not super extreme kind of forms, are also playing in setting up a flip more generally? Are they too mild? Yeah.
Yeah, they're too mild. I don't study contemplative practices because A, they often don't work, and B, you kind of get what you expect. I'm much more interested in people's extreme experiences that happen in a car accident or in a heart attack or in a sexual encounter, and are completely unexpected. And they often violate very clearly whatever the worldview of the person is. And that interests me.
Right.
Because that doesn't fit into what my own colleagues would expect. And it also is very hard to invoke something like wish fulfillment or self-construction in it, because it's something that's appearing to the person or happening to the person. It's not something the person's practicing. And I'm not against practice. Please don't mishear me. It's just that's just not what I do.
Right. I do think that it plays a role in shifting people away from materialism towards panpsychism and
I started
even
out
idealism.
in the contemplative world. Like I said, I mean, I wanted to be a monk, talk about a contemplative life. But what I've learned over the years is that some people can sit on that cushion and they'll have, an experience within hours or days. Other people can sit on that cushion for years and absolutely nothing will happen. And so, and the religions are geniuses at coming up with reasons why, none of which I believe, by the way. I just think people are different, and some people fall into samadhi or Zen mind instantly, and other people are just like myself, are dull. We just don't. We just don't do it. And so I also think this is getting into a whole nother topic, but I also think trauma is really important. I think trauma is often necessary to induce an altered state. And that then leads into morality and all kinds of issues, kind of sticky wicky issues that we can talk about.
Yeah.
But I think if you actually study the history of religions, what you realize is that a lot of it's trauma. And by that I don't mean to reduce the experience to the trauma. I mean that the trauma might in fact open people up to some other reality that is actually the case.
Well, since you put the icky sticky right on the table, let's go into it.
Yeah.
Which is, how do you handle thinking about trauma in this context, particularly if you're interested in figuring out how people can access these realms? It's like that you can sit back and collect anecdotes of people who didn't expect it, and they have the car wrecks and they have whatever. But there's a lot of people out there who are now seeking, and in a way, one way of looking at psychedelics is that it's a large dose psychedelics create a certain kind of trauma,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
can facilitate certain things. It might not be trauma, then you get into trickiness about what exactly counts as trauma. You've been very willing to use the term at a time when you were kind of talking about something a little bit different than the growing cultural obsession with trauma, to the point that now it's almost like, you're an average novel, the way that characters are introduced is based on their trauma. Like the trauma narrative has become the way that people organize their subjectivity. And that's a little different than what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But yet there's a relationship there. So I'd love to hear you think more about like what wrestling with trauma has been meant to you as a category over the years.
So the thoughts on trauma are related to my thoughts on the mind-brain relationship. And and I stress the word tentative. The tentative conclusion I've reached is that the body and the brain are not productive of consciousness. They're reductive. In other words, the body and the brain mediate and translate and reduce consciousness, but they actually don't produce it. And what that means is, if you want to have an experience of some larger form of mind or consciousness, you have to traumatize the body and the brain. You have to somehow stop it from reducing and translating and mediating. And that happens to all of us eventually at death, but it also happens to us in serious illness and in all kinds of difficult life circumstances, which, by the way, our ancestors had in a much greater number than we do. And so it's not at all surprising to me that our ancestors were more religious than we are, because they simply had more of these experiences. They were more traumatized. They suffered more. So my views of trauma. It's not that trauma is a good thing. Trauma really messes people up. It's really bad. But sometimes it can produce an ability to dissociate, and it can lead to the ability to have extraordinary experiences later in life. And we don't understand why. We don't know why it just destroys some people and it enables others. And I've learned that lesson by listening to people again. This is, again, my constant refrain. If you listen to people carefully, they will tell you these things. And so when I sit down and talk to an experiencer, I'm always listening for two things. I'm not telling them this, but I guess I'm telling you now. This is being streamed, right?
Yeah.
So this is no longer a secret. I'm listening for sexuality. Something's going to be in the story that has to do with sexuality, and I'm listening for trauma. And often those two things appear together, not always, but they almost always appear. And usually the other thing I've realized listening to people is that the story they tell you the first time is never their full story. It's never true. It's never weird enough. If they tell it again, it gets stranger. And if they keep telling it, it just gets strange. And there are some things they'll tell you that are so strange they're just off every map, but that's part of their experience too. So when I was a youngin', when I was a young person in graduate school, I really operated with this assumption that somebody somewhere knew the truth of things, and I just had to read enough books and talk to enough people, and I would eventually find the author or the person who knew it. That's bullshit. Don't believe that. That is not true. Nobody knows. Okay, nobody. And the people who have these experiences, if they keep telling you the experience, they'll get to this point where they're like, yeah, I don't know what that's about. But so in other words, the truth doesn't get more and more clear.
Mm.
It gets stranger and stranger and stranger is what I'm trying to say. And that's why I said, get weird. That's part of how to think impossibly, is to stop this search for clarity and for simple truth, because it's not to be had. What is actually true is strange and weird to your sense of what is reasonable, and so
Right.
that's what I'm trying to say.
Great.
And it's not that the weird experience is literally true either. Of course, I'm not suggesting that. But I think when you put all of these experiences together, you start to develop this model of the human that is very different than what we have.
Right. I got a question about the ethics of interpretation. One of the ways that you defend the humanities is you talk about them as a source of justice, of criticism in light of the call for justice.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an ethical call towards
Yeah.
practice of humanities. As you gather and announce and explore and affirm all of this range of marginalized experiences, you're of course putting yourself right in this conflictual relationship with mockers and skeptics and snarky science, the whole thing. And you understandably are totally sick of that, and you are very defensive of it. Sitting a little bit on the sidelines of this, I note sometimes that there is something profoundly ethical in that kind of skepticism, which is that people are easily manipulated by bullshit.
Yeah.
And some of the people, not some of the people who make a living off of these stories, I believe, are just bullshitters. I don't know which ones exactly. I got my suspicions. Some of them I explore. I find I can read articles that are critical but understandable, and I could go, yeah, that one I'm not so sure about. Like, I think they're kind of bullshitting. Not in a way to discount the whole field, but as a way to kind of focus on what's valuable.
Yeah.
You tend not to do that very much. And I'm wondering if there is a role for a certain kind of skepticism vis-a-vis human agents who are bullshitting, who are making up a story to tell something. It has a value, because I notice the absence of it as a way that I sometimes go, God, I wish Jeff would occasionally take one of these characters down, because some of them are just in it for the buck or for the thing or for whatever. So that's my slightly cynical but ethical probe to you there.
Yeah.
Not that kind of probe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know.
We didn't have that kind of mentor-student relationship.
No. Let's talk about the probe for a minute. Actually,
Sure.
So I actually know the man for whom the joke of the anal probe began.
Yeah.
I not only know him, I wrote a book with him. His name's Whitley Strieber, and he had an abduction experience in Christmas of 1986. And then a whole series of further abductions, that one of which involved an anal probe that extracted some feces and resulted in an ejaculation as well. And Whitley made I don't think it was a mistake. I just think it's Whitley being Whitley. He made the mistake of telling the truth. He just said what happened. He said, yeah, this is exactly what I was raped by, whatever this thing was. And a new cartoon called South Park picked it up in their very first episode and mocked him, and it resulted in this cultural meme about the anal probe. But it's really just Whitley being honest about what he experienced. And so that's again what I'm trying to say about how to, if you want to think impossibly, you put the anal probe and you put the ejaculation, you put it right in your zone, and you don't do the South Park thing. Let South Park be South Park. But that's not what you're about. So to me, that's ethical. And by the way, when Whitley first pursued his abduction account, it was a crime. It was a crime scene. The famous alien on the cover was done by a crime artist, and the psychiatrist who treated Whitley was treating it as a crime because his anus was bleeding. They ripped open his anus. So there's a profound moral component here, but it's not the moral component that the culture has, I think. Okay, so let me back up. That was a long footnote. What did you ask me about? Why I don't go after the debunkers? Yeah. Okay.
Right, or just
Yeah.
if you ever have
Okay.
the sense that let's clear.
Yeah. Let me say a number of things.
Okay.
First of all, people ask me all the time. And I do a lot of. I've done hundreds of podcasts, and they ask me almost every single podcast, "How do you deal with the pushback?" And my reply is always, "What pushback? I don't see it." Intellectuals, including the scientists, are generally in the closet on this one. They know damn well these things happen, but they don't want to talk about them in public because they don't want to sound like the tabloids and they don't want to lose their respectability. So Jeff, the professor of religion, who knows nothing, by the way, can come in and say whatever he damn well pleases because he's got nothing to lose. I have no cultural authority. Professors of religion know nothing, right? But the physicist has a great deal of cultural authority, and the psychologist a little less, and the historian a little less. And somewhere way down here is the religious studies guy who knows nothing. So the less cultural capital you have is what I'm trying to say, the more you can talk about these things. And my sense of particularly intellectuals and scientists is that there isn't real pushback. There are a few of these professional debunkers who make a lot of noise. Their arguments are vacuous, by the way. They're completely vacuous if you know the material. They're just rhetorical devices that for some reason people believe. I don't know why. And it's been my long experience that I can have way more interesting conversations with people like you than I can with a debunker. Because I know exactly what the debunker is going to say. I know exactly what it's always a he, by the way. I know exactly what he's going to say. I know what the criticisms are. I know how they're answered. It's like this mechanical box. It's not even remotely interesting. The other thing I will say, and this is tougher, Eric, this is more complex. Let's call it the phenomenon. I think the phenomenon is itself deceptive. Okay? I don't think deception is just a function of hoaxers and people committing fraud. I think the phenomena itself is tricking us. Okay? And I think a lot of religion is essentially faking it till you make it. They're not telling the truth either, but it's not about truth in that way. It's about living out some kind of thing and doing it until it happens. It's like your contemplative practice. You're creating that which you believe. So I think the relationship between what I'm trying to get at, I think the relationship between deception and reality is very complex. And I think the human being needs to be tricked into our own capacities. And religion historically has done that. Actually, the placebo effect in medicine and pharmaceuticals.
Shaman tricks.
Oh, shamans are just they're hucksters, but it works.
Yeah.
And there's a reality behind the trick too, often. And so, because I study religion, I essentially study tricking people. And as I often joke to my colleagues in the academy, the humanities, it's the ultimate conspiracy theory, folks. If you want to be suspicious about everything, just go study the humanities. They'll give you all kinds of sophisticated ways not to believe anything, right? And they're probably right about that. Okay, so again, where does that land us? And that's where I think that's why I'm so interested in paranormal phenomena. It's not because I believe them, it's because I don't believe them. And it's because nobody actually knows what's going on. So to me, that's a really intellectually provocative question. It's like, wow, something that's not exactly us is screwing with us and is pretending to be this or that or this, but it's not this or that or that. What is going on here? What's a human being and what's this phenomenon? I mean, so those to me are like really interesting questions, but you can't even begin to answer them with a lot of the methods that we've discussed.
Yeah.
It'll just fly right under it.
Yeah. Well, I could keep asking you questions here, but we're moving on, and I wanted to open it up for some questions. We have quite a lot of interesting folks here. So, you got a question for Jeff? No one's going to do that. Chris.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. I was hoping to get a couple of social scientists who wouldn't do that kind of the perennial philosophy thing, like everybody's got DNA. We've all got a nervous system. We're all got the bodies. And can't we spend another 150 years or so having a kind of truth and reconciliation commission across all the indigenous knowledges, across all the other kinds of things where there may be a question, do we all have DNA? Is there a body? Is there a humanity? I mean, is there any room for that? Not believing anything quite yet until we've talked to everybody who's been outside the conversation forever?
So I think, yeah, that's a question for me, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
So what I call the prophetic dimension of the humanities is essentially that. It's the affirmation that human beings are different and live in different realities, and we need to take those realities seriously and not shove everything into a rationalist kind of academic Marxist box, which is essentially what we do, what academics do. One argument is that, which is your argument that you just related, is that we just need to do this longer. I think that's a legitimate argument. I can see that, but I don't see why we just have to do one thing. I guess this is my deeper argument is people think that if you focus on the paranormal or the impossible or the transcendent, you somehow can't do the prophetic. I don't accept that. I think that the paranormal or the transcendent or the impossible is itself prophetic, and that they relate to one another on a profound level, or they can relate. Sometimes they don't relate, by the way. Sometimes people employ paranormal or magical phenomena to do really bad things. But again, if you're a historian of religions or culture, you know that the history of magic is mostly about killing things or manipulating people. It is not about doing beneficent things or becoming one with God. So we know that historically and religiously, human beings can use their abilities for all kinds of purposes. And what I'm calling the superhumanities would study that, as well as those places in history where the paranormal or the impossible appear alongside the prophetic. So I think it's all part of what I'm trying to say is it's all part of the conversation. But I think right now we're kind of in an either or mode. And I think we have to move out of that. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and.
So can't the measurers just measure what they can measure and let them go?
Except the money part. See, this is a conversation I had at Johns Hopkins. They said the same thing to me. Basically, the humanities and the sciences should be on equal footing. And I'm like, but they're not. It's 50-1, folks. You have all the money. We don't have it. You're cutting us. You're cutting our programs down. You're not hiring our graduate students. You're eliminating departments. This has real impact. This isn't about everybody has a form of knowledge. They do, but it doesn't mean everybody's supported. And I guess that's what I'm trying. And like, take my own field. The study of religion is, frankly, a very fragile creature. And a lot of my or our ancestors ended their lives in jail or in prison towers or were melted in the public square. It wasn't a pretty sight. And so I just don't trust human culture, frankly, to encourage some kind of free thought around religious experience. I don't trust any culture. So I think there's that too, kind of somewhere. And so if I can just answer this again, I think the role of the intellectual is to question things, not to affirm whatever the social arrangement or order of knowledge is to question that order. And that therefore has a prophetic dimension to it, but it can also work against whatever the prophetic goal or project is. I don't want to deny that. It's tricky. It's tricky, but this should all be part of the conversation.
That's great. Yeah.
This is a response.
Okay. Harlan's got it. Harlan's on the
Yes.
mic.
Do you address in the study of paranormal the spontaneous Kundalini experiences that some people have? Like, I'm reading a book right now by someone who is explaining that. I've met several people, and does that fall under your scrutiny?
question?
Spontaneous Kundalini experiences,
sure.
just what you're, if you
I
treat
think
them-
people have spontaneous Kundalini experiences all the time, but I'm not sure why we're calling them Kundalini. I mean, they can be put in any number of cultural frameworks. We privilege the tantric Kundalini framework because we're in California, but in a Baptist church in Texas, they would be gifts of the Holy Spirit, or they would be something else. So I'm not privileging the Holy Spirit either. I'm saying, can't we step back and talk about these things in a way that doesn't privilege a particular culture or a particular tradition? But I think spontaneous, what people call Kundalini experiences, are like really, really important, because they shatter what people think is possible, And they also root a lot of things in the body in a really powerful way.
Yeah. I just want to pull something out on this one, which is, it seems like one of the places that more work could be done, not just in treating anecdotes or people's experiences, but sort of in the lab, so to speak, not necessarily a scientific lab, is just the whole question of energy. What do we mean by energy?
Yeah,
what are these energy
do we mean?
experiences?
What do we mean by
What is the
energy?
relationship between energy and orgasm? What is the relationship between energy and opening experiences? There's something there that's not quite physical, but it's much more tangible than a lot of the kinds of things you talk about.
I'll give you an example. So this new book, How to Think Impossibly, there's a whole chapter on a very autistic gentleman, super autistic, who, his own description now, who has a Kundalini awakening and spent decades in Kundalini communities looking into all this. And one of the things he points out, which goes to your concern, is that in a lot of tantric systems, particularly in South Asia, the idea is that the energy begins in your lower regions and can move up instantly into your cranial region. And the word they use a lot is retas, which means something like sperm or seed. But we know sperm can't get from the male genitals to the brain. There's no channel. It can't happen. But Kevin points out, hormones do. Hormones cross the blood barrier and they can zip through the body just like that. And so he reads his own Kundalini awakening in kind of a hormonal framework, and he rejects the traditional Hindu models of retas or sperm because he knows a lot about physiology and physics, by the way. And so I think we can actually, we can nuance this conversation and push it forward, but we can't get stuck in honoring a particular culture. is what I'm trying to say, including our own, by the way. And that's a very difficult thing to say these days, frankly.
Oh yeah, you made a question. Wait for the mic.
Earlier, you were asking like the word mystical and replacing it with something else, and it seems like for you, the word impossible is sort of that. I was at Esalen recently and was in a workshop, and a word kind of popped out of the workshop that for me has been the word. And I'm just curious if either of you have a relationship with this word or have a feeling about it, and it's transrational.
Yeah. I mean, that's impossible. That's the impossible is, how to think impossibly is to not be bound by reason. Reason is a particular human cognitive capacity that gets us all kinds of things and is really important. But when people have particular kinds of experiences, they're not rational. They don't fit into these reasonable cognitive structures that people are expecting. So I don't know where the word transrational comes from. It sounds very William Jamesy, but I don't know. It probably has some other history.
It's
J.A. Martin? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's fine. I actually don't mind the word mystical at all, or as an adjective. To me, it means unitive. Any kind of experience of union or communion with a deity or the universe.
You had a question?
There was a hand here.
Yeah.
So you encourage us through all of this to leave everything on the table and to consider, to get weird and take these things seriously. Taking this advice in mind, do you consider the possibility that all of this maybe does have like a strictly rational, maybe like self-generated, as just our mind playing tricks on us in ways that maybe we don't understand yet?
Yeah.
Do you think that's a possibility, or is that something that, given the insurmountable evidence, you kind of reject? Is that something that's on the table for you, that all of this is explainable in a rational way eventually, perhaps?
So there's a position in neuroscience called promissory materialism, and essentially what it argues is what you just suggested. I don't think it's certainly not worth me keeping on the table. I think these things clearly will not be explained in those terms. And the reason I say that is the history of science has not worked like that. The science has never survived. The science of one century is always never the science of another century, and paradigms fall, frameworks fall, and other frameworks are put up. So this also comes out of the flip, that there's a renaissance in the philosophy of mind today, and there's a growing awareness. The conviction in the 90s was this conviction you articulated, that somehow consciousness would be explained by brain processes, that we will get to a place where the neurons are sufficiently organized and synchronized in a way that we'll be able to explain consciousness. And philosophers of mind and even a lot of neuroscientists just don't believe that anymore. They just think that's hopeless. And it's the wrong paradigm. And so they're moving to things like panpsychism and dual aspect monism and other models that don't begin with the assumption that everything can be explained by reducing it to something more basic, which is how reductionism or materialism works. And they just don't believe it anymore. And I guess I'm convinced of that. And also the other reason I say that is the models, the rationalist materialist models that are certainly used today always dismiss paranormal phenomena. And the reason they dismiss them is you can't put them on the table and take them seriously because they violate the very principles that you're using on the table. And to me, a model is always a better model if it keeps more things on the table. And so I really like models that just accept that human beings have these experiences and then try to reason from there. What must the world be like if this happens? Well, that happens. So what must the world be like? And so that's my criterion.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
You could also ask the question, what must the mind be like for that to happen?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to be external necessarily. It could, there is a possibility in which all of it is internal, just in a way that transcends our current models entirely. Is that something that you see as possible?
So I don't think you mean that. You don't mean that in an idealist sense. You probably mean that in a materialist sense. Idealism is the position there's only mind, and that this material reality out here is a representation or a manifestation of mind. You mean that something like Stewart's mantis is a function of his own mind that's projecting that? Yeah, okay. So this is why I'm so interested in paranormal phenomena, because unlike experiences that could be read as projections, there are physical things happening in the environment that can't be explained with that. And those to me are like really interesting precisely because there's an internal and an external dimension, and neither model actually works to explain both. I'll give you another example. This one will really, I think, either blow people's mind or just offend you. I don't know. There's a book coming out in the fall called They Flew. It's just called They Flew. And it's by a historian named Carlos Ayer. He's a Cuban-American historian at Yale. And it's about Italian, Spanish, and Latin sources from really mostly from the 16th and 17th century. And what Carlos points, the subtitle of the book, by the way, is A History of the Impossible. This is perfect. What Carlos points out is that people flew. People floated. There were hundreds of witnesses in broad daylight doing things like pushing a nun around a room because she was like floating like a balloon and they could push her anywhere they wanted. And they were taking other women going into ecstasy into the church, and so people could all stare at them while they floated off the ground. And I mean, you have a pope, you have barons, you have dukes, you have surgeons, you have all kinds of witnesses to people just floating off the ground. And Carlos is like, what do we do with that? So I think that's the kind of phenomena. And by the way, people float today all the time in abduction accounts and in demonic possession. Those are the two things in which people float. And I don't think we can explain those with internal projective models. I think we can explain a lot with internal projective models. I'm not against those, but I don't think they're useful in every situation. Yeah. I actually, all of the models in the humanities, I'm like, yeah, that's right. But none of them work all the time. They're kind of temporary, or they're kind of useful here, but not over there. I guess that's my frustration. That's not my frustration, it's my fascination.
Thank you so much, guys. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah.
Jeff, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to riff for a second on what time must be like if we take the stories that you tell really seriously.
Yeah. I riff on it a lot in the book. The paranormal phenomenon that I'm most impressed with is actually precognition. And it goes back to your question. The reason I'm most impressed with it is it's extremely well documented, and it involves the physical world as well as the mental world. So someone, for example, will have a dream of something that's going to happen the next day or the next week or the next year, and then it'll play out more or less like that. Sometimes exactly like that. Often it's distorted or camouflaged in particular ways. but I'm completely convinced that the future already exists. I mean, if you asking, I think you are asking me my own metaphysical positions on temporality. I think there is no time. I think we kind of live in a glass block universe, and the past is happening right now. The present is happening right now, and the future is happening right now, and we're just kind of moving through it. And that when people have a precognitive experience, what's actually happening is their brain, their physical brain, which exists in the future, is working back in itself and relating to itself something that's some piece of information that is probably crucial to that person about the future. So my own view of time is that there is none. And that, of course, we experience temporality and the movement of time, what we call history or biography. Of course, that's true, but that is not actually what is the case outside of a body and a brain. That's my view. And I think you see that in the history of religions all over the place in terms of eternity or timelessness. I mean, it's kind of common as water. But there's also some really, really relevant and powerful examples of it in the modern world that have really convinced me. And I'll give you an example. This goes back to an experiencer. I worked with an experiencer for 3 or 4 years named Elizabeth Crone. And Elizabeth is a Jewish grandmother now who lives in Houston. And in 1988, she was struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue on the yahrzeit or annual anniversary of her grandfather's death. And after this lightning strike, she developed all kinds of paranormal capacities, including precognitive dreams, always of plane crashes or tsunamis or earthquakes that would appear in the news the next day or the next week. And she started to email these things to herself to sort of establish the dream or the nightmare appearing before the event. Where I'm going with this is, so a lot of these experiences are in our book. We wrote a book together called Change to the Flash. And a lot of these precognitive dreams that involved major plane crashes that you know about, she had. But what I noticed about the precognitive dreams is that they were always from the perspective of the photograph or image that would appear in the news media. I had taken the naive, I think it's naive, the naive religious view that what happens in a precognitive event is the soul leaves the body and you travel to a future time and you float over the scene somehow and you watch the event and then you go back to your body. But when I was working with Elizabeth's precognitive dreams, it occurred to me that actually none of that's true, and that it could just as well be her brain from day 2 feeding back into her brain of day or night 1, and it's telling a story. It's spinning a vision of the crash, but actually she's remembering something she will see on the TV or on the internet now the next day. And I think that's actually what's happening. So that's what I'm talking about, is to really understand these things. I think we need new models of time and the brain. And we also have to be deeply suspicious of whatever the experience is of the person. This is kind of where I'm going with this. Like I told Elizabeth this, I said, Elizabeth, I don't think you're actually there. I think it's you looking at the event on the internet or in the newspaper, TV the next day, and that's somehow traveling through your physical brain into the present. She was like, that wasn't her experience. But it wasn't like she was, I didn't say that in a mean way. I just said, well, that's what it looks like to me, because it's always the perspective of the photograph in the media. So that's what I'm calling for, is can we take these experiences as part of by seriously, I mean veridical. I mean part of the real world. I mean part of reality. I don't mean I believe you believe that. I mean, no, these are actual cognitive sensorial events, perceiving something in the physical world. Can we take that as such and be suspicious or critical of the visionary content of the dream or the vision? And I think the answer is clearly yes. Of course we can do both. I did it. I mean, Eric can do it. I mean, why can't everybody do it? Why can't Elizabeth can do it now? You know, and what Elizabeth will say when you get her going, and you can get her going very easily, by the way. Whenever I appear with Elizabeth, I'm like, I'm the warm-up band for the Beatles. You're the Beatles, and I'm the warm-up band. But when you really get her going, what she'll say is that a near-death experience is essentially dying into the imagination, and everybody will have his or her own near-death experience. So there it is. That's what I'm saying. There is a there. People are having these experiences, and it's being formed by culture and religion and the imagination. It's a both and. It's not an either or. That's what I'm trying to model.
This is reminding me of something that I talk about in High Weirdness, that Terence talks about in the experience of La Chorrera, where if they feel like they've encountered the other mind, a cosmic mind, and that it's using all the contents of his own memories and all the books he's read and the science fiction and the pictures to like a collage.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of this thing that Jack Spicer, a Bay Area poet from the 50s and 60s, San Francisco Renaissance poet, and he gave this wonderful. He wrote very abstract poetry that's kind of experimental, and he gave this wonderful analogy where it's like he said, "No, I aliens write the poem, Martians write the poems, and what the Martians do is they just take all the. It's like you have a bunch of language blocks, and you're just kind of like telling a story by putting these blocks together. So the words aren't what their message is, but there's something behind it, kind of composing it, and that allows you to do all the hermeneutics, all the critical contextualization, historical resonances, allusions, but it also loops in this thing that you've been talking about how if you hermeneutically analyze these experiences, you see that there's a referentiality on another level, like maybe the mantises are there because there's this pun embedded in the history of the idea of the imaginal that is actually part of the circuit of the references that the thing is constituted by to a certain degree.
Let me go back to this gentleman's question about projection, because I think there is a lot of projection going on, but it's not conscious. It's not intentional of the experiencer, but it's clearly a kind of cultural projection. So the person who really started our Archives of the Impossible project at Rice was Jacques Vallée, who lives right here in San Francisco. And Jacques has a very distinct view of the UFO phenomenon that is unlike anything out there that I'm aware of. His argument, which I happen to think is correct, is that what a UFO is, it's an actual there, and it somehow beams or radiates a human being, and then a freaking movie goes off in the head, and the human being sees little aliens, or sees a spaceship, or sees whatever science fiction they're writing. So, but it's inherently deceptive. It's tricking us, but there's an actual there. Not a spaceship, not an object in the sky, but something is happening that's actually very real. And so that's kind of a combination. And essentially what I'm trying to push is, yes, all the projection and all the culture and all the history is active there, but there's also a there that is interacting with the human being. And what I've never been clear on, this is another question I often get, is, well, is it really extra human, or is it some other aspect of ourselves? And I don't know the answer to that. I actually have no evidence that anything that happens to a human being is not human.
Excellent.
I have none. If all religious experiences, including all experiences of God I've ever heard of, it's always a human being telling me that. Always. It's always a human being writing that. Always. Always. Well, yeah, I mean, even the alien or the extraterrestrial, it's always a human being telling us the story. Always. So my own gut feeling is that it's us. But it's not us as in the brain or the social ego. It's us as in us, which just completely, I think, blows the sockets, I hope.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, our Olympic founder here is sitting there with the mic, so I think she's got a question,
Oh,
and maybe that will wind it up. Or are you going to introduce the end of the show?
That's what I was doing. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to see whether you were going to ask a question or not.
I have a lot of comments, but I won't take advantage of having access to the microphone to make them. But we should talk about the invention of EEG, you and I, at some point, because it's a cool story. Well, what I'm about to say is that, first of all, thank you so much. This was mind-opening. Just speaking personally, I really enjoyed it. And I believe that, so we will have tea, and also, if you're into that sort of thing, water and snacks in the lobby for a little while. And I believe, can you stick around for a little while? So if you have a burning question that didn't get answered in the room, we'll let the people who know what time this was supposed to end go, and we can all stick around and geek out a little bit more with Jeff. So thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with the excellent questions. And Eric, thanks to you too. Let's just all clap for everyone. Good job, everybody. But before we go for tea and snacks, I just want to let you know, especially if you haven't been here before, if you're here for the first time, we do an event like this that's like a more a kind of talk with a Q&A about once a month. And several times per week, we have meditation and movement classes and workshops. We have several that meet weekly. We have an art integration workshop that meets monthly. So if you've had kind of a big experience and you're looking to bring it somewhere and integrate it, we have the amazing Christina Lazar, who did the Green Tara painting in the lobby. She's here once a month doing art integration. And we also have all sorts of special events and workshops, all coalescing around the areas of meditation and movement, neuroscience, scientific inquiry and discrimination, and psychedelic and visionary and imaginal culture. So if that's your thing at all, I'd encourage you to sign up for our mailing list. We send out one email a week, and it's written by Sasha Chapin, who's just an amazing writer, and then it's edited by Eric and I, so we punch it up a little bit. And it has whatever's coming up that week, but it also has like a paragraph at the top with whatever Sasha's been thinking about that week, and like really it's worth it just for that. So you can sign up for that on the iPad in the lobby. You've got 2/3 of the founding team of Alembic here, so if you have any questions about what it is exactly that we do here, we're figuring that out right along with you. You can ask us, and we'll all be available in the lobby. Looking forward to talking to you all. Thanks again, guys. Thank you all.